In the nick of time, glad we held on. All right, everybody, good afternoon. I'll go ahead and get us started. So today, for the next hour, we'll be having our first work session on AO 2024-105 and 105S. Then immediately subsequent, we'll be having a separate work session on the same ordinances with a different focus. Today's work session, this one, the focus will be on amendments and S versions and conversations about various approaches. I think this is the third or fourth. I keep having a little difference of opinion with the vice chair on if we've had 3 or 4 work sessions on the topic, but it's hard to track. We've had so many conversations. Maybe some of them are committee meetings. So we'll just go ahead and do introductions.
Randy Solt, Felix Rivera,
Mark Littlefield,
Karen Bronga,
Anna Brawley.
Daniel Voland.
Meg Zalto.
Christopher Constant.
Cameron Perez Verdia.
Right. We have Assembly Council, we have Clerk's Office, we have Assembly Finance, Assembly Legislative Council, we have our Legislative Support Services. We have Jenna from the AEDC at the table. We have a nearly full room. And so the intent of the meeting today was to convene to talk about various amendments and alternatives to the initial proposal. And we're going to let this one be driven by the sponsors. Conversation we had earlier this week. I will manage the queue and if need be, do whatever needs to be done. But I think we have Mr. Salt and Mr. Rivera to lead the show today.
Okay, thank you. So we have a slide pack that should be on the website. And this is what we'll go through today. We also have handed out an S version as well as the original version. We'll be working from the S versions. And the main purpose of this presentation is just to go through the changes between the original and the S. The S has not been introduced yet, so we still have time to modify it, trying to keep the number of S versions simple. And with that, I'm going to turn over for the first couple of slides to Ms. Wright.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. And thank you for the opportunity to just provide a few opening remarks today. I wanted to just start by thanking the Assembly. I recognize you all have a lot on your plates right now, and we are very grateful from the Business Coalition that you all are taking the time to engage with Project Anchorage. I think I'll start by just kind of providing a quick refresher of how, why we're here and how we got here. Project Anchorage is really the culmination of years of discussion and over a year of focused effort on this particular version of Project Anchorage from the business community. And we have really poured ourselves into this project because we care very deeply about Anchorage, and we believe that if we don't take a bold step to invest in ourselves, we're going to continue to see people leaving our city and the subsequent decline. And that's something that's really concerning for us as business leaders. I know, of course, all of you as well as city leaders. So if we could go to the first slide, please. So we started Project Anchorage with the primary goal of creating a revenue measure that would allow us to invest in ourselves in a way that's similar to other cities that we've seen do it so successfully. And, going into this, we were very clear-eyed about the challenges of passing any new broad-based revenue measure. And because of that, our business coalition spent a significant amount of time conducting research to develop a proposal that's specifically designed to address voter concerns and create a compelling value proposition for the city of Anchorage. And through that process, we learned that in addition to capital investment, meaningful property tax relief through the diversification of our tax base was important to Anchorage residents. And that's why we're supporting the property tax relief component that will go towards making homeownership more affordable to the tune of about $100 a month or $1,200 a year. And in addition to that, we're finally going to be able to capture some of the spending that's done by the tens of thousands of commuters that come into our city each workday, and then the million or so visitors that visit as well. Next slide, please.
I'm going to jump in real quick and just say there are a bunch of slides here and we have alternative concepts. So we're going to allow this half an hour and then we'll have alternative proposals and then just broader conversation. So
thank you, Chair Constant. So, one of our guiding principles of determining the direction of the capital investment that we're recommending today was for it to be completely community led. We knew that in order to receive community buy in, the projects needed to come from the citizens of Anchorage for the citizens of Anchorage first and foremost. And so, we started this process in early summer by launching a press tour and community presentation roadshow. And we were trying to get the word out as wide and far as we could about our project solicitation portal. So we divided and conquered, and we took as many interviews as humanly possible. We went to almost every community council meeting, I'm pretty sure, boardrooms across the city, community groups across the city, and we successfully received over 300 project ideas from the city of Anchorage. Next slide, please. So then once we received all of those projects, we formed two different volunteer committees. The first was focused on really organizing the project submissions, evaluating them for feasibility and impact, and then sending them forward to a professional poll with a representative sample of Anchorage's diversity. And what that did is it gave us clear data into which projects were most exciting and attractive to Anchorage voters. And then those projects were then sent to another volunteer costing committee that was focused on assigning very rough order of magnitude cost estimates to each of the publicly supported projects. And our goal with that particular exercise was not to assign a specific budget to each of the projects, but rather to validate that conservatively and on average, we could build the slate of capital projects with the budget that Project Anchorage would create. And so just to wrap up my initial comments here, I wanted to share that the Project Anchorage Business Coalition is very aware that any new broad-based revenue measure is going to require a strong and well-resourced campaign to ultimately receive the approval of Anchorage residents. This truly is a very big change for our city, and it's important that the public understands what we're trying to accomplish. So our coalition is very committed to seeing that happen and taking total responsibility and ownership over a ballot proposition. And that's because we really believe that Project Anchorage represents this once in a generation opportunity to invest in ourselves and help to reverse some of these concerning net outmigration trends so that Anchorage is our thriving, growing city once again. So I'll close by saying that we have truly loved the community process, the assembly process, and hearing ideas on changes that can make the proposal even better. So we look forward to the additional discussion today. And thank you so much for your time.
Okay, so next slide. In spirit of what the chair said, I'll blaze through these. So this is the assembly timeline. It's not the overall timeline. And really, I'm just going to focus on the last one. Action set right now for January 7th. So there will be public hearing at that meeting, and then hopefully we'll go to a vote. Next slide. Going to go over the major changes. So we focused on clarity and specificity, community requested changes, assembly member requested changes that we are made aware of in open debate. And then we include the recommended project slate, which is slightly modified from what we showed you last time. There were other changes that we agreed with that we were going to put in, but we know they're coming through as amendments. So we decided to pull it out and let the amendment form the change versus what this group has been thinking. Next slide. Okay, so changes. So inclusion of projected property slate, including community defined priorities, 11 proposed investments, as Ms. Wright said, resident driven, geographically diverse, public projects for public enjoyment, includes funding for public safety and snow removal fleets. That's what we discussed last time that we added. As you know, in the mayor's budget, there is a potential levy to do the same thing. So this would ideally offset that. And then, so we don't have the headache that we had with some of the Project 80 projects, is we are building in the operation and maintenance funding as part of the capital funding when the project's created. Next slide. Okay, enhanced language around operations and maintenance. So we actually, before we were using 4% for our calculation, now we've broadened that up and bound it between 5 and 15% of the project tax would go towards that operation and maintenance fund. And update the definition of the MAP Citizens Advisory Board to clarify what that board's role is in Project Anchorage. Next slide. We put in nonprofit exempt purchaser language to make that more clear. And incorporated, the Foraker Group gave us some recommendations on language around nonprofit, so we incorporated that as well. Next slide. We had a recommendation to keep business information confidential. So as you collect net receipts and sales tax, some of that could be exposed public data if we wanted to keep that confidential. And then we put an exemption for regional housing authorities. So that came from Cook Inlet Housing to make sure that they were also considered as kind of like a nonprofit. Next slide. We incorporated several amendments that Member Bronga brought forward. Exempts contraceptives from sales and use tax, qualified educator expenses, and then of those, of other exemptions for, you'll see discussion around 80% AML or other exemptions to limit regressivity. We wanted to pull back that the alcohol, marijuana, tobacco would not be included in that exemption. So if you get that exemption, which is going to come forward through an amendment, and I believe also there's a marijuana and alcohol tax amendment, that would not be part of it. Yeah, that's
Mr. Bond.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, in the S version, the alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco are exempt or are not?
they are not.
They are not exempt. Okay.
But there is an amendment
Right, got it.
coming
Okay.
forward.
Perfect. Thanks.
And then make sure we're all clear on that last part. So whether the tax exemption for residential households is 80% AMI or 80% federal poverty level, whoever receives that exemption would not apply if you're buying alcohol, marijuana, tobacco. That makes sense. Okay. Next slide. Oh yeah, sorry. I didn't see a change. Thank you. Enhanced online sales tax collection. We had that in there, but we wanted to make that a little bit more clear. So we've updated that definition that online sales from out of state are included, and streamlined collection or remittance of taxes on remote sales. We also, it's not in the slide pack, we did update some definitions through the recommendation of council. Next slide. Okay, the capital slate. So this is the revised list of projects that will be recommended in the S version. So public safety vehicle fleet, snow removal heavy equipment fleet, Kincaid Trailside Facility, Goose Lake Trailside Facility, Westchester Lagoon Trailside Facility, Anchorage Children's Museum, Downtown Arts and Entertainment Redevelopment, East Anchorage Sports Center, Chester Creek Sports Complex Redevelopment, Eagle River Sports Center, Girdwood Arts and Recreation District. Now there is a way to bring new projects forward by bringing them forward, putting them on the ballot, and then they would go into the slate. Now this slate, through the recommendations of the committee, would be prioritized and based on funding goals achieved would happen or not happen. They wouldn't come off the list, but would be the intent to get them done. It just depends on what the actual revenue is.
Ms. Salaton has a question.
Yes.
Do you know what the estimated total capital cost of all of the projects is? Not 1 and 2, but 3 through 11?
Do you have that? I don't have that.
I don't have that number with me right now, but we did estimate that it would fit in the existing budget.
But if we're going to be possibly moving numbers around, we need to know how much each one of those is estimated to be, because if we
Mhm.
start making shifts, we would need to know if we had room for them. Thanks.
Yeah, we do have the spreadsheet with the numbers, just don't know them off the top of my head. Thank you. Next slide.
Hold on, Mr. Vaughn.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. So on the projects that were selected, was there any like cross-referencing with like plans, adopted plans that the municipality has? Or, because I know that these were nominated by the community sort of writ large, anybody who wanted to could nominate a project. But then did we go and say, okay, well, a Westchester Lagoon Trailside facility, which personally I love the idea of, but is that consistent with former, prior community council resolutions or adopted plans?
We did look through the CIP list. We looked through things like the downtown plan, and the way that these are written has the ability to adopt a lot of those elements. So for instance, downtown arts and entertainment redevelopment talks about improving the pedestrian experience, which is in the downtown plan. So yes, we definitely did look through that.
Thank you.
Mr. President.
Thank you. Just remind me again, we went over it before, but the percentage that's being taken out for maintenance and operations and this sort of thing, is that essentially a flat percentage regardless of the project? Does that vary depending on if it's a new building versus sort of a community update? How is that working so we know that we have the resources to maintain whatever we build or we create?
In the last iteration, it was 4% of the total project cost. And as you look through the project, some are going to have more operations expense and some less. So the idea is that's the average based on industry experience.
Okay.
As the projects are fleshed and estimates are updated to higher percentage levels of confidence, those numbers will be updated to reflect it. And so if we collect a pot of money and the list of projects is larger than that pot, then that's where the committee will come in and start trying to prioritize that list for assembly approval.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay, next slide. Okay, and just last slide, I've already spoken to it, but there are amendments which we'll get into now that we know of that are coming forward. So there are things that the team agreed with. We had language in, we actually pulled it out because we wanted to see what the amendments brought forward and allow more input and creativity into the process. And I believe that's my last slide. Yes, thank you. Chair?
Thanks. Yeah, well, actually, before we get to the amendments, I have a question. Mr. Gates.
Sorry, I just wanted to add a short explanation to Mr. Solto's response to Mr. Perez-Verdia. The operations and maintenance costs are intended to be covered by investment earnings from the trust fund that's filled with the 1% tax revenues. And then that oversight board is going to set a level where, like, for example, 60 million, if we estimate that usually we have a 5% return on 60 million, is that enough to cover the O&M? And if not, they determine that level. If it goes up or down as projects are completed, they maybe raise that over time.
I'm sorry, I had Ms. Brawley before myself. Ms. Brawley.
Thanks. Yeah, this is on the projects, I guess. Two kind of related questions, and I understand that the S version may address this partially. The proposal right now says that we pay cash. We use 100% equity for all of these projects, and it does not allow financing. I guess I want to register a concern. Well, two questions. One is, if there's 11 projects up there, you mentioned the committee would prioritize. If all of those projects come back with a 10% cost escalation before they can be constructed, how will we decide which ones come off the list? And then the other question is, are these at all contemplating public-private investment such that, a sports facility, for example, it's common for the team, the owner of the team to put in significant investment, or if we're doing, retail space or things, right? There's things around it that could happen. Does this preclude that, or are these assuming 100% municipal only investment with no opportunity to add on to those projects, especially if there's no financing?
I'll take a stab at it and I'll turn over to Ms. Wright. So the second question, the answer is kind of yes. So the goal is we're going to spur investment. We're going to put up, for example, prior there was a food hall on here. That's been taken off because there already is private investment for a food hall. So we may help facilitate the access to that area where that food hall is going to go. And what was the first question? Sorry.
Oh, it was really just in the scenario where everything has a cost escalation of 10% and not everything can get built, then how do we deal with that?
Right. So what would happen is the committee would put forward their recommendation to the assembly for approval, and the assembly would ultimately approve that. Now, anything to add, Ms. Wright?
Thank you. Yes. The first thing I'll start with is that we received your feedback on the equity only piece and made a clarification in this S version that only general obligation bonds are not eligible. So we can use revenue bonds for these projects based on the feedback from yourself and other members. In terms of how to decide which projects stay on the slate if costs get out of control, we intentionally use very conservative estimates as we were looking at each of these projects. And they're written in a way where they're specific enough to where voters know what it is that they're going to, be purchasing essentially, but they're flexible enough to where if we get into a situation and the sports center costs more than we expected for some reason, we could reduce the size, we could change the actual programming that's in there. So there's flexibility along the way to right size these different facilities. And then I think Member Solt mentioned that this does not preclude the ability to do public-private partnerships. We would certainly support that actually.
Okay, so I have myself in the queue. This is now 1.5 work sessions spent on the Ooh Shiny New Projects Fund. Good, great. Let's sell it. And it's a sales pitch that we're hearing. But there are major concerns on the substance. And it's on the 2/3, not the 1/3. And so was any effort made, or is there any thinking that the sponsors have done to address what was raised in the public hearing on Tuesday of the massive expropriation of local dollars to give away to outside property interests in the context of we have $120 million. The proposal was put forward that it's about 60% will go to the largest commercial property owners. We know most or many of those are not Alaskan residents. So we have an argument that says this tax is going to actually tax tourists and visitors. And I heard the number was around $20 million of expected annual revenue from tourists, but we're going to send out of state $70 million annually. Where's that coming from? It's coming from poor people. It's coming from average kind of representatives of the community, kind of community members. So still the fundamental structure of this tax is to take local limited resources and ship them into the pockets of wealthy landowning interests that probably don't even live here. So I don't see any amendments within the package or any detail in the substitute version that works to achieve, well, maybe in the amendments are some, sorry, in the S version, I should say, sorry, that addresses how to rebalance that so that we aren't just telling people we're going to tax tourists, but really what we're going to do is send all that money out of state. So what is happening in the structure of this to mitigate the expropriation of Mountain View and Fairview dollars to Mr. Widener, for example?
No, it's a good point. And we talked about this long and hard, and we consulted with Assembly Council trying to find a way to target residential properties. And basically that came back as illegal. We couldn't do it. We do know there are potential discussions around the exemption for personal property. So raising that exemption amount, trying to rebalance the exemption. And we know that some amendments are coming through to try to address that. So that was, again, one of the things that we left
When you
it to
say personal
amendments.
property, do you mean real property?
Real property, sorry, yes.
Thank you.
So we, again, it's one of the things that we decided to leave to the amendments and see what came forward.
Yeah, I think that some of us who tried that found the same blockade, that it's not feasible. So what that leaves us with is a package that drives local dollars out of state. And I'm concerned about that. So other members, no, or not, we can start going through the amendment proposals. Mr. Voland.
First for the amendments. Okay, so you have Volin Amendment number 2 in front of you. And so I guess, first of all, I'll just say I appreciate all of the conversation that this has spurred in our community. And I've heard from a lot of folks who love the current proposal. I've heard from folks who do not feel similarly. And I've heard a lot from folks who say, I support this element, but not this element. And so at the end of October, I reached out to council and I said, okay, I want to keep this conversation going. And this is sort of, I'm not married to all of the stuff in this amendment, but I wanted to bring forward some ideas just based on feedback that I've heard, and with a lens to try to make it less regressive. So a few things that I am putting forward here and kind of just want to socialize this to my colleagues. Number one is to make the 3% sales tax permanent, so that we wouldn't go back and ask permission of the voters every 7 years. Secondarily, that the 2% of that tax would not be used for any property tax relief or reduction, but instead go to the general fund, general government operating fund for any public purposes. I heard a lot from constituents who are interested. They said, we support a sales tax. We recognize the need for it, but we are worried about the regressivity of the property tax offset. And we also are worried about the focus on new shiny things. And, what about the basic essential municipal services, snow plowing, fixing our infrastructure, et cetera. Third, I add this should say alcohol and marijuana and tobacco products to the list of exemptions because they're already taxed, and I don't think that they should be double taxed. I think that would be a hardship for the hospitality industry. And then fourth, and I guess for me, this is like the one that I'm maybe most passionate about, and I think something my colleagues will recognize that I've been talking about for a long time, and that is taking a look at the business personal property tax. Right now, we have an exemption of $20,000, and this is more ambitious to increase that exemption to 250,000 contingent upon passage of the sales and use tax. And so for folks who are not familiar with that, every business, whether it's a small business in Anchorage or a big box store, has to pay personal property tax. That includes their furniture, their computer technology, any assets they have related to the business, as well as their inventory. And so I recognize that there is a lot of business community support for this proposal. And I thought, well, instead of, a giveaway to large property owners and several of which are out of state, what's a way that we could still retain a benefit to small businesses and startups and particularly, local manufacturing, which is a sector that I want to see grow in Anchorage. And so I think increasing that exemption could be very helpful. A few of us members were able to attend Alaska Startup Week, and I brought that idea forward, and it was, I think, warmly received. And I'll just say it's also the business personal property tax, I think, is something that's very difficult to collect and enforce and make sure that it's being paid accurately. When I talk to business owners, I usually hear one of two responses: either, "Oh yeah, man, it sucks to have to pay that every year," or "What? I'm supposed to be paying what?" So anyway, those are just some ideas I'd like to throw out there into the mix. Thanks.
Right, so I have a number of folks in the queue, but I think they're relating to their own amendments. So Ms. Brawley, for your amendment, if so, we'll hold for now.
I can present now if you
No,
like,
no,
or-
that's fine. So we'll hold for that for now. In case there are questions or comments for Mr. Volland. I think Mr. Salt might have one. Go ahead.
Yeah, similar. You and I have talked about the business property tax, and I do like that concept. But have you looked at the analysis, or maybe something to look at, is how much of that would also go outside of the state to your larger corporations? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have the specifics on that. I think for me, by increasing the exemption, and I think Member Zolotel, when she gets into her proposal, she has some numbers, but increasing the exemption, there's still going to be some room to collect, right? So a big box store that has $1 million plus of inventory, we're still going to be collecting from them, right?
All right, so I have kind of a comment, and I have an amendment, but I don't need to make it because at least at this time it's available, but yours also addresses the alcohol and marijuana concern. I want to speak briefly to it. For me, those two industries are facing challenges right now. They're already taxed, new taxes, and some would argue, then why would we not do that for the motel, hotel bed tax and the car rental tax? And those industries are very well established and in fact performing more highly than they have ever done before. And so I see them distinct and different. And if there is a thread within this conversation in which we are intending to levy some form of taxation on visitors, then those ones are directly targeted to that purpose, as opposed to the alcohol and marijuana sales, which are generally speaking local business owners and operators serving local purchasers. And so I strongly support some ongoing protection of the alcohol and marijuana industries in town. And it's not kind of necessary to wrap in there the conversation about the bed tax, because practically speaking, it achieves a different purpose and a different means and from a different source. And so I just want to put that on the record. And I'll make that amendment if it should be necessary, depending on which items get on the floor. But to Mr. Walnut's point, I think that those two industries are experiencing substantive downturns and challenges, especially the marijuana industry, and the state tax scheme is very impossible for them to manage and is creating real sustainability problems. On the amendment, Ms. Braga, okay.
So I'd heard earlier that you couldn't single out just local property taxes, tax owners or property owners to get the tax exemption. But is that possible with Mr. Volan's amendment for the businesses if they are local, so that we are, I'm getting a head shake, no. Okay, all right, so that's,
I heard all about today how we cannot treat a tax base in any different set of categories. Hard stop.
okay, then one more question. On your amendments, if we are going to not give the property tax exemption, have you considered maybe making this tax smaller instead of 3%, 2%? Because right now it's supposed to be, this much to property tax exemption, this much to the project. So maybe we wouldn't need to collect quite as much. So that's my question to you, Mr. Volan.
I considered it. It's not what I brought forward, but I think it's an interesting question. And I will just say on the second bullet point there, I'm interested in what, if there is a property tax relief portion to the final proposal, wherever it ends up, I just want to make sure that it is balanced with other priorities, which is the reason I have that there. I think, there's maybe a delta between 2% and none.
Ms. Briley.
Just really briefly on the alcohol and marijuana thing, another question I want to put to the sponsors and really everyone to consider is voters dedicated alcohol tax money to certain purposes, and they just dedicated marijuana tax to certain purposes. I understand it's legally possible to stack them, so that's not the issue. The policy question is really if and when those taxes increase. I guess I'll say I think this caps that ability to increase those, and so would voters prefer that those taxes on those products continue to go and potentially grow to the dedicated uses that we've already chosen, or would they prefer them to go to this other tax now? I mean, really, I think it's a question that we should consider is what have voters already said on that point? And I think, and I want to add that in addition to the consideration about industry, because that also does apply to bed tax. And I don't think that we could increase them ever realistically if we do this.
And that actually raises a slightly different question. And it's a good question to come out of this conversation. So we have a dedication that's created under both alcohol and marijuana taxes. And then we're layering this on top, but the charter still says those taxes are dedicated. So does the actual text of this proposed ordinance and charter amendment fix that, like in such a way that it states the difference above the X percent is to these projects as opposed to the previous, or are we creating an unsquared conflict within the charter?
So I'll jump in. So we met with representatives from the alcohol and marijuana industry, and Member Rivera and I were working out an arrangement with them because some of those taxes are capped. I think in 2027 is when they can be increased to a cap. And generally the coalition is ambivalent on whether they're exempt or not. So knowing that these amendments were coming forward, we pulled back what we were offering in favor of see what the amendments have. So I don't believe we have an opinion really one way or the other whether they're included or not.
So it's a slightly different question. It's the technical legal piece, Dean.
Yeah.
Well, I hope I understand the question, but I will add that stacking sales taxes, retail sales taxes, I don't think there's any prohibition on that. It's a common practice. But I think that what you're asking, the dedication is 5% and this 3%, that's partly 2% 2% and 1% dedicated for something else. For the consumer at the point of sale, suppose it's $100 purchase of marijuana or alcohol, you're paying $8,
Different
and it's
question,
5
Ian.
for that, 2 for
Different
this,
question.
and 1 for that.
Different
And that's
question.
perfectly legal.
Different question. So the question is, in the charter, it currently states marijuana taxes are dedicated to childcare. Is there language
Yes.
in this proposal that states that dedication is only to the first 5% and the difference is towards tax relief and other items? Or are we creating a conflict in the charter?
I don't see the conflict. We have in this proposal on page 8, that's why we specifically added that subsection E that refers to the charter provisions for the marijuana tax and the charter provisions for the alcohol tax. But the marijuana tax dedication is just 5%. This is a different tax added to the same purchase. So
Yeah, I think that I'd like to explore that a little bit more in some writing, kind of an analysis that states that the 5% is the limit to the dedication of the ACE fund and that the difference would be otherwise, because how I would think of it is all the money raised for marijuana taxation is supposed to go into the child care tax fund. And so I just want to make sure that the technical legal documents are sufficiently crafted to protect against a conflict of interest trying to determine which goes where. So anyhow, just some very clear, concise language that demonstrates the differential would be helpful.
Yeah, and then Mr. Chair, if I may. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think getting to Member Brawley's other sort of policy-related question, I personally believe that voters can want two different things. They can want marijuana tax to be invested into childcare and alcohol tax to be invested into the various different buckets, and also want these different projects and property tax relief and that slight addition to the tax going to that. I don't see those necessarily being in competition. Now, how it all technically works out and how we make sure that we're not overtaxing a particular industry, I think is a different discussion, but I think voters can want both of those at the same time.
Other questions? Okay, I think that concludes our discussion about Mr. Boland's proposed amendments. Next, I think Ms. Salatel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I didn't have a chance to do amendments per se, but I have ideas and I've placed those on a document. So we've not been able to limit the overall tax relief per parcel. That was my first instinct to address the inequities and to really look for a more equitable solution. But I went around and around with council and the answer is a firm no. So I have some other ideas about how to get to the equity of the tax. I put forward in the spreadsheet some scenarios for dedication, 50% property tax relief, 1/3% property tax relief, and 25% property tax relief. I then broke up what is in the S version between dedicated projects, i.e. the capital projects, the project list, and then MOA dedicated use, which were the currently suggested as snowplow and police fleet. So I broke those separately, just for my mind, it's a little bit easier. And then in one of my scenarios, I break it into 4 buckets, 25% property tax relief, 25% dedicated projects, 25% dedicated MOA use as that'd be just approved by the voters, and 25% general government. This really drives to my question about what the estimated cost is for those projects and how many projects in each of those scenarios would be able to go forward. And you see what the property tax relief does based on some property valuation numbers. And shout out to Claire Bozema for giving me the math that I could then put into a spreadsheet. So you can trust this math more than Meg math. But it tells you what that is. I also took the administration cost out from GO. It's $4 million estimated administration costs. So we've been given 2 scenarios, $154 million in revenue and $180 million of revenue. I took the $4 million out on top. The back two spreadsheets, you will see me having adopted a bit of Mr. Volan's idea. If we were to completely eliminate business personal property tax, I would want to replace that. I wouldn't want to ratchet down the cap. So that's where those are. Okay, so that's money. It still gives us big buckets, I think, for capital projects, anywhere from 269 to 359 million or 315 to 419 million, depending on the estimated tax collected. I also think putting more money towards dedicated MOA services and broad-based services benefit more residents and help reduce its regressivity. I also don't think there should be a tax cap on purchases. If we can't cap relief, we shouldn't cap the tax liability. Like, to me, those things are equal. So if a parcel can get maximum property tax relief that we're offering, then you should pay the maximum amount of sales tax on any purchase. If you can afford a $50,000 car or a $100,000 item, you should just pay the taxes. Most important though, and Mr. Stolt mentioned it briefly, there's a big difference between area median income and the poverty level. So I want to draw your attention to, I gave you AMI for 2024. You look at the 3-person line there in the purple box, AMI at 80% is $87,250 for a 3-person household. The federal poverty limit at 80% for 3 people is $32,270. We would reach more people and really be much more less regressive if we used AMI. It's a $55,000 difference. And if we are worried about the effects on people's pocketbooks for this, especially if they are not property owners, to be able to take the property tax relief, this, I think, is a key change that needs to be done. Lastly, and this one, I mean, we have to do something like this, or I will just be real honest with y'all, like, I can't vote for this, is some kind of universal municipal benefits application. If we are going to create an exemption process based at a particular income, we need to do so where we can accept as the municipality one application and use that application with the big carrot of sales tax exemption to screen that application for every service someone is eligible for in the municipality and then offer it to them. It is very hard to navigate lots of social programs. So why don't we just take it upon ourselves to collect information and then make the offer? Oh, hey, great. Here's your exemption for sales tax. Did you also know you're eligible for childcare assistance or reduced bus passes instead of having to become an expert in everything? So those are my proposals. For me, shifting the percentages to something at 50% or more, 50% or less for property tax relief for that distribution, increasing the exemption for households based on income to 80% AMI, and including a universal municipal benefits application as part of the charter, not some, I don't want to wait till an AO implementing it later, would be absolutely necessary. Thank you.
I didn't notice when, but Mr. Martinez joined us on the phone a little bit ago. And so any comments or inputs for Ms. Salato's approach? Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, I just want to raise a concern that I've heard, and I do really appreciate this work. It's definitely more numbers than I'm offering at this time. But I'm concerned about what I've heard from some folks, which is, and I think it's for the hardship exemption. I appreciate the idea of this benefits application. I think that's a value. I wish we could do that regardless. But it's really the concern that we would be stigmatizing people at the point of sale, that they would have to pull out a card that says, I don't make enough money to afford to pay this sales tax. And so I just want to register that. And I think it maybe is something that we'll continue to discuss in the next work session. But I just want to say that now, because that is something I've heard, and I think it is something we need to grapple with. And I wonder if the sponsors have a response to that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. It is also something that I have heard from members of the community, concerns about stigmatization and having to show proof of being poor every time that you shop for something and you don't want to pay the sales tax. So I think certainly I am open, and I think the coalition is open to however we want to design that tax exemption. But And really the ordinance, the way it leaves it open-ended, right? It says there's going to be this exemption. How we achieve that isn't necessarily detailed in the ordinance because it is, I think, a larger question.
Okay, and I will say that there was a member who mentioned an idea that everybody who would qualify for an exemption, including every church. Yeah, yeah, please.
All right, yeah, so one type of exemption card for all exemptions. So if you are a nonprofit or whatever, the exemption card is the exemption card. You don't have to say why you have the exemption card. You just are a qualified person with the exemption card. Like, we don't, right, there are more than one type of exemption built into this tax.
Right, and so that gets to the destigmatization, and I think people who are hungry are gonna say, give me the difference rather than the stigma, but I think there is a way to craft it as one line that Ms. Zalato proposed, that I think is rational. Okay, Ms. Brawley, I think it's, oh, Mr. Salt, go ahead.
This is just to address one of Member Zalatel's questions. One of the reasons we put the cap at $1,000 was we looked at other jurisdictions and we didn't want to drive sales outside of Anchorage. So if we had no cap on buying a car, I'm going to go to the Valley and buy a car. And that's what we wanted to try to prevent. So thank you.
Yeah, okay, anyone else on Zalato's proposal? If not, Ms. Brawley?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and I'll be brief. And I'll preface this by saying, I'm not going to go through all the written items here, but I wrote them out so folks can read them. The amendments go from very broad conceptual down to more details, but I've not drafted any of these yet. I guess I'll say I have serious concerns with this, and it was really hard to even identify what type of amendments I would want to bring because I believe unless the fundamentals of this change, it is not fiscally responsible to put this to voters the way that it is. I don't have a lot of confidence that making the scale of changes that we're talking about really solves all those issues. And I understand this is a work session for amendments. So I just want to highlight some of the things that I would like to see change in addition to what's already been shared, because I do support a lot of the changes that have been brought forward or proposed changes to try to solve this issue. I think it's fundamentally, I want to see this tax and I want an amendment or a change. And I am meeting with Mr. Begich and Ms. Boersma next week to discuss this in more detail. I want to see this reflecting things that we need and not things that we want, because I think that is a fundamental thing about this tax that really concerns me. And I have a lot of serious concerns that it will not pass voters, regardless of what the polling says. And the things that I think we need, and these are getting to this, is if we are going to dedicate revenue, we should be dedicating revenue toward housing production and towards energy. And I am concerned, and I would like to see amendments about things like taxing professional services. And I'll disclose, I'm a consultant, so in theory, my professional services would be taxed, as well as my partners. But I'm bringing this up specifically around housing production. So as this stands right now, construction services would be taxed. Granted, there is a transaction cap tax at the moment per day. I don't know how that interacts with complex construction contracts that span multiple days or monthly invoices. But again, I'm worried that we are putting something forward that does not speak to our other needs, and it does not, and it would actually work against what we are trying to do. I believe taxing services for construction of housing production is counterproductive to what we're trying to do. And then the other thing that I'll just briefly highlight as a potential, we already talked about the equity, we already talked about some of these other pieces that are really more details, is I would like to see, if at all possible, maybe it's not possible, I would like to see consideration of how this interacts with stormwater utility implementation. Because the reality is the taxpayers who will cover, the ratepayers who will cover the costs of that new utility are mostly commercial landowners. So I think there is a valid argument to provide some property tax relief in order to not overburden everybody who owns commercial property who becomes a utility ratepayer in that system, because we need drainage systems so badly. Again, getting back to what we need. I also think we need other portions of our fleet. This talks about public safety and it talks about snowplow vehicles. That makes me wonder, what about our parks department? What about all of the other departments who also have fleet needs? What does that do to those? So I worry about the over dedication of because we've done this in the past as well. We've over dedicated money to certain things and we've left other things to languish. And I'm worried that as a general policy, again, this is not fiscally responsible to continue that policy posture. And I would like to see significant changes. And so I offer all of that, knowing that that is a really big piece, but that I absolutely need to see this change before I believe it is a fiscally responsible thing to put before voters. And I've put a number of amendments conceptually on the table, and I look forward to speaking about them more with this, not the assembly sponsors, but with the folks working on the tax. Thanks.
Right. Any input? Nope. Okay. And I will just note that separately, I have worked with the administration, and two fleet levy proposals will be laid on the table for introduction on Tuesday, the 7th. And so whether or not this passes, we'll have the opportunity, or gets on the ballot, or whichever path the assembly chooses by 8 votes or 7 votes, that will also be in the mix in a very specific and concrete way within days. So any further discussions? Go ahead, Ms. Alatal.
Dean, how many votes does this take to get on the ballot?
Because this is a charter amendment, it requires a 2/3 vote of the assembly members to put it forward to the voters, so 8 or more.
Any other inputs or questions? Mr. Voland.
I guess for the original sponsors, realizing we just received the S version, but I think it's a draft S version, right? What is the timing going to be of finalizing the S version? And do you think that there are amendments that potentially you would incorporate that were discussed, or should we just kind of keep it all separate for now, or what's the best path going forward?
I'll talk about timeline, and then Member Sell can talk about any other amendments. So we did commit that we wanted to get an S version onto the December 17th agenda. So obviously that means the addendum deadline of next Thursday. So between now and Thursday, we'll look at any possible changes of incorporating amendments, and then I'll turn it over to Member Sell.
Yeah, we'll have to get back to you on that, because the intent was to allow the amendments to come forward on this S version. And we don't have a good way to reach out to the amendment sponsors and say, hey, we're going to take your amendment and put it in. So for now, I'll say we're going to leave it to the amendments to modify the S version that we bring forward. I think that's a cleaner way to do it.
Mr. Gates.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make sure, it's my duty to advise the full body. I mean, I've worked with individual members on this in various variations of this tax proposal, but I just want to make sure the whole body is aware that our advice, my advice in the Department of Law, is that this is a sales tax. You should have just a ballot proposition first. And I understand you want to wrap a lot of other things into this one ordinance, but the real, I guess, path forward is usually get the voter approval for the sales tax for the ballot proposition, and then you do all the implementing code sections and all of that later, exemptions and so forth. And I just want to point that out because, I mean, you can do it this way, of course, but I'm just pointing that out because we're trying to do everything at once rather than sequential steps, getting voter authorization and then doing the rest. We can tie ourselves in knots about exemptions and details and so forth about the code changes. And that's fine, and that's a choice to proceed that way. But I think it's difficult to do so.
Yeah, I think that underscores the purpose of our next work session. The reality is, as they say, the devil is in the details, but if you don't have any details and you levy a tax, you're stuck with the bad deal, and there's no way around it because then the charter supersedes any ordinance. And so it's a problem. We're in a catch-22 situation. Do we make sure it doesn't hurt people first, or do we hurt people and then figure out how to hurt people less? And so that's at least how I look at the decision-making process, where we have to look at closely what is going to go, what is going to be allowed, what is not going to be allowed. And so if we don't have some of that in there, then we are left stuck with a situation that is, you must levy this tax and you only have certain bounds from which you can exceed. And so Ms. Salatal.
Dean, based on what you just said, is it possible, like with the business personal property tax, to bring either a concurrent AO or something like that says in the tax proposal itself, if this, basically this tax passes, this thing goes away, or a higher exemption rate kicks in as a result of the voters approving it?
Well, yes, that's what Mr. Vollin's floor amendment does. It adds a section to this ordinance. You could do it as a separate ordinance for the business personal property tax. Just say this isn't effective until this passes. You just put that contention effective language into his proposal.
Mr. Salt.
Yeah, we do have in there that any future exemptions could be brought forward and approved by the assembly.
There are lots of details on this conversation. Again, to the proponents, I'll reiterate that I had hoped we would see this June of this year. We could actually have time to sort through these before we hit a very hard deadline that is coming quickly. So with that, I think we'll take 5 minutes. We'll be convening back in 5 minutes to have the second half of this conversation today.